The night is quiet, and the world has slowed to a gentle stillness. This is the perfect time to drift into story. A story that begins not with sudden mystery or fear, but with the calm rhythm of life in the deep forests of Arizona. Long before the event that would capture headlines and stir endless debates, there was simply the land itself, vast, rugged, and timeless. The tall pines reached skyward, the red earth stretched out beneath them, and the silence between the trees seemed endless, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the distant hum of a saw. It was here, in November of 1975, that a small group of men finished another long day of work. They had no way of knowing that their evening would become part of one of the most enduring UFO mysteries in American history. For now, they were only tired, dusty, and ready to head home. And before we continue, let me gently say this: if you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, mysterious and soothing, consider subscribing. That way, you'll always have another journey waiting for you. Whenever you need to rest, let us return to the forest. As the sun begins to sink behind the mountains, and the quiet shadows of evening stretch across the land, northern Arizona in the mid-1970s was a land that seemed to stand apart from time. Vast forests spread across the rugged high country, where the air was thin, cool, and touched with the resinous perfume of pine. The trees stood tall and watchful, their trunks dark against the fading light, their needles whispering whenever the wind moved gently among them. The ground was layered with decades of fallen needles, soft underfoot, muffling sound, so that even a man's steps seemed hushed and careful. Here and there, boulders of pale sandstone pushed through the soil, shaped by centuries of weather, and the occasional creek wound its way through the valleys, its water so clear it mirrored the sky above in the mornings. These woods were alive with activity, the flutter of birds, the calls of animals hidden just beyond sight. But by late afternoon, a different mood settled in. The forest grew quieter, as if holding its breath. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the branches, dust motes drifted in the glow, and a stillness wrapped itself around the land. The towns of Snowflake and Heber lay miles away, small settlements that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Out here in the Mogollon Rim country, there were no highways humming with cars, no glow of city lights. The sky belonged to the stars, unchallenged and brilliant. At night, the Milky Way stretched wide and luminous, and the dark between the stars was deep enough to feel endless. For the men who worked here, this was more than just a landscape, it was a daily companion. They had grown used to the smell of fresh-cut wood, the roughness of bark against their hands, the creak of branches shifting in the breeze. The forest was harsh at times, but it was steady, and in that steadiness there was a strange kind of comfort. Yet, for all its familiarity, the forest also held its secrets. In the silence between the pines, there was always a sense that something might be watching, hidden among the shadows, as old as the land itself. And when dusk came, when the sun's last glow sank behind the mountains, the woods often felt less like a workplace and more like a place of mysteries, cloaked in darkness, waiting for the night to unfold within that endless stretch of Arizona forest. A small crew of 7 men worked side by side. They were not dreamers or storytellers, not men who sought the strange or the unknown. They were laborers, bound by the rhythm of their tools and the demands of the land. Each day began before dawn. The men would gather in town, climb into a battered truck, and ride out together toward the forest. By the time the first light touched the tops of the trees, their saws were already buzzing, axes striking, and voices rising in short bursts of conversation. The work was difficult, physical, and relentless. Trees fell with deep, resonant cracks. Branches snapped and scattered, and the scent of fresh-cut wood hung thick in the air. Gloves wore thin, shirts dampened with sweat, and boots pressed hard into the soft earth. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and among the men there was a bondan understanding built on shared effort. Laughter during breaks, and the quiet trust that comes from long days spent together. Among them was Mike Rogers, the crew boss. He carried the weight of responsibility for every man on that site, guiding the work, setting the pace, and making sure the job moved forward. He was steady, serious, a man who understood both the forest and the men who worked it. And then there was Travis Walton, younger, more spirited, with a spark of curiosity that often showed in his eyes. To Travis, the forest was more than a workplace. It was a place alive with wonder, a place that stirred something restless within him. His strength and energy made him valuable on the crew, but his eagerness sometimes set him apart. The others, Ken, Steve, John, Alan, and Dwainich, brought their own character to the group. Some were quieter, keeping to themselves, while others filled the breaks with stories, jokes, and laughter that made the long days easier to bear. Together, they formed a circle of rough-edged but dependable men who trusted each other in the dangerous work of logging. On that November afternoon, the pattern of their day was no different from any other. Tools, wind, trees fell, and the hours passed slowly into evening. Muscles ached, gloves grew stiff with sap, and the sun dipped lower through the tall pines. They were tired, ready to finish, ready to climb into the truck and return home. To them, this was just another day. Another evening drive down the winding forest road, another nightfall in the Arizona woods. But the forest had something else waiting for them, something none of them could have imagined. As the day's work drew to a close, the forest seemed to sigh with relief. The last echoes of saws faded. The final trees of the day lay still against the earth, and the men began gathering their tools. The smell of fresh sap and cut wood lingered in the cooling air. Carried gently by the wind through the pines, Travis Walton moved with the others, but his eyes often strayed upward, to the sky slowly deepening into shades of rose and violet. He had always been drawn to the forest's quiet beauty. Noticing details others often overlooked, the way the needles shimmered when caught by the slant of evening light, the way the breeze seemed to hum low through the trees, the way dusk arrived, not with haste but with a slow, inevitable drift. That evening, November 5th, 1975, felt no different, at least, not yet. Travis laughed along with his crew as they loaded the truck, their boots crunching softly over the carpet of needles. The men spoke of ordinary things, the soreness in their arms, the meals waiting for them at home, small jokes that passed easily between friends who had spent long hours together. But beneath the familiarity of routine, there was a quiet energy in the air. The sun sank lower, shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to lean inward, darker and closer with each passing minute. The truck door slammed shut. The engine rumbled to life, and the crew settled in for the ride back toward town. Travis leaned against the seat, the fatigue of the day beginning to sink into his bones. Yet, even as he rested, his mind remained alert, as though the forest itself still held him in its gaze. Outside the window, the pines stood like sentinels, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sky. The first stars blinked into view, scattered across the vast, unpolluted heavens of northern Arizona. It was a quiet, ordinary evening, or so it seemed. None of the men could know that. Just a short drive down the forest road, they would soon encounter a light unlike anything they had ever seen. A light that would turn a familiar ride home into the beginning of one of the strangest and most enduring mysteries of the modern age. And so, with the sun gone and the forest wrapped in shadow, the men steered their truck down the winding road. Their voices were low, their laughter soft, the weight of the day settling into their bodies. The night around them deepened, until a glow appeared in the distance, faint at first, but unlike anything the forest had ever held before. The truck jolted as the men climbed in, one after another, boots scraping against the metal step, tired hands pulling the doors shut with a heavy thud. The scent of gasoline mingled faintly with pine. The old seats creaked beneath their weight, and the engine rumbled to life with a familiar growl. Inside, the air was warm with the presence of 7 men who had worked shoulder to shoulder all day. Their shirts carried the smell of sweat and sawdust. Their arms hung heavy at their sides, and their faces were etched with the satisfaction of finishing another long shift. Laughter rose in easy bursts. Someone told a story from years past about a mishap on the job that had become a kind of legend among them. Another joked about how stiff his back felt, and the truck erupted with chuckles, the kind of weary humor that only comes at the end of a long day, though the work was hard. Moments like this made it easier the closeness of friends who understood the strain, the risks, and the quiet victories of their labor. The road ahead stretched long and bumpy, but inside the cab there was a sense of comfort, of familiarity. Mike, the crew boss, steered the truck with steady hands, his gaze fixed on the winding dirt road. Beside him, Travis leaned against the seat, eyes half-lidded, listening as the chatter rolled on around him. The younger men teased, the older ones gave half-hearted grumbles, and the truck rattled onward, carrying them slowly out of the forest's deep interior. The sound of tires crunching over gravel and needles filled the pauses between their words. Now and then, a branch scraped against the side of the truck as they passed, leaving faint streaks of sap across the weathered paint. They had no reason to hurry. The day's work was done. Ahead of them lay warm meals, familiar homes, and the simple relief of rest. It was, for the moment, nothing more than an ordinary November evening in northern Arizona. But outside the windows, the light was fading fast. The forest, which had cradled them all day in its golden afternoon glow, now grew darker, its edges sharpening into shadow. The men laughed, unaware that each mile carried them closer to something extraordinary, something that would soon turn their quiet ride home into a story the world would never forget. The last glow of daylight lingered at the horizon, a faint band of orange and rose slowly sinking behind the mountains. Above it, the sky deepened into indigo, stars blinking awake one by one, as though carefully placed into the vast canvas of night. Inside the forest, the change was even more profound. What only an hour ago had been warm and sunlit was now steeped in shadow. The tall pines stood as black silhouettes, their outlines jagged against the dim sky, their branches rustling faintly in the cooling air. The men inside the truck felt the shift too, though they didn't speak of it. The chatter grew softer, replaced by the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of tires over gravel. Their laughter faded, as though the silence of the woods was seeping into the cab itself. From time to time, someone glanced out the window, watching the forest blur past. In the darkness, details disappeared. The underbrush became only shapes. The trees melted into a wall of shadow, and the road ahead narrowed into a tunnel of dim light cast by the truck's headlights. The air grew colder, pressing in through the seams of the doors. Breath fogged faintly in the cabin, a reminder that November nights in Arizona's high country could chill the skin as quickly as the sun slipped away. It was the hour when the wilderness seemed to change its character, when the lively calls of birds gave way to the distant cry of night creatures, when the familiar turned strange, and when even ordinary men could feel the stirring of unease. Still, nothing seemed out of place. The forest was only being what it had always been, vast, quiet, and ancient. Yet, within that growing darkness, something unusual waited, something that would reveal itself soon. Just beyond the next stretch of road, the truck rattled steadily over the rugged dirt path, its headlights cutting narrow tunnels of pale light through the surrounding darkness. Each bump and rut sent a low shudder through the cabin, jostling the men against the worn seats. The rhythm of the road became almost hypnotic, gravel crunching beneath the tires, the occasional thump as the suspension groaned over dips carved by rain. On either side, the forest loomed close. Towering pines crowded the edges of the road, their branches heavy with shadows. The deeper the truck pushed into the night, the more the wilderness seemed to close in, swallowing everything outside the beam of the headlights. The men shifted in their seats, each lost in thought. Some stared out the windows, trying to pierce the darkness beyond. Others leaned back, quiet now, lulled by the monotonous ride. Their earlier laughter had faded entirely, replaced by the steady hum of engine and tires. There was a strange comfort in that silence. For men who worked among trees and earth, the wilderness was a companion, even in its darker moods. They were used to these roads, used to this landscape, but tonight there was a subtle difference. The forest seemed unusually still. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have gone quiet, leaving only the sound of the truck's passage through the night. The headlights flickered over the road ahead, revealing nothing more than dirt, rocks, and the occasional fallen branch. Yet, within that ordinary scene, an edge of tension began to creep in. The men couldn't have said why, but there was something in the air, something just beyond the reach of their understanding that felt out of place, unseen and unheard. The wilderness was holding its breath. The truck rolled forward, its engine humming low, when suddenly something flickered in the distance. It was so faint that the men thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. A pale shimmer appeared between the trees, far ahead, like moonlight breaking through the branches. But the moon was not in that direction, and this light was different. It pulsed gently, as if alive, growing brighter for a moment, then softening again. The men leaned forward in their seats. Someone muttered under their breath, wondering aloud what it could be. No one answered. The glow didn't look like headlights, nor the steady beam of a flashlight. It seemed suspended, hovering, not tied to anything earthly. As the truck drew closer, the glow spread faintly across the treetops, painting the pine needles in an otherworldly silver. The air itself seemed to shimmer faintly, though perhaps that was only imagination. The driver slowed, instinctively cautious. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires grew softer as the truck crept along, its headlights pointing directly toward the mysterious radiance. Inside the cab, the men shifted uneasily, their earlier fatigue forgotten, replaced now with a nervous curiosity. No one laughed. No one spoke. They only stared ahead, drawn toward the strange, silent glow that had appeared out of the stillness of the Arizona night. And as the truck inched forward, the glow sharpened, no longer a vague shimmer, but something with shape, something hovering low among the trees. The truck rolled to a hesitant stop, its engine grumbling softly before falling into an uneasy idle. The men sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the clearing just ahead. There, suspended above the ground, was a light unlike any they had ever seen. It was not the harsh glare of a lamp, nor the steady beam of headlights. Instead, it glowed with a soft brilliance, as though the air itself had been painted with firelight and moonlight at once. The shape shimmered between the trees, revealing itself slowly, as if it were being uncovered, layer by layer. The object hung silently in the forest clearing, no larger than the size of a small house. Its surface seemed to curve smoothly, polished like metal, yet it radiated with a faint golden glow, pulsing gently as though it breathed. At times, the light shifted, sliding across the craft's surface in ripples, catching the branches of the pines and reflecting them in strange, distorted shapes. No sound came from it. The night was utterly still. No insects stirred, no animals rustled in the brush. The silence was so complete that the men could hear their own breathing, shallow and unsteady. The longer they stared, the more unreal it seemed, like a dream, like a mirage. And yet, there it was, hanging effortlessly, steady, as if the laws of the earth did not apply. One of the men whispered a quiet word under his breath, barely audible in the hush. Another shifted nervously in his seat, but none of them could look away. The glowing object hovered patiently in the forest, as if waiting. Inside the cab, the men exchanged uneasy glances. Each of them searched the other's faces, hoping to find some explanation, some ordinary answer that would dissolve the strangeness before them. But no one spoke with certainty. It's probably just a helicopter, one finally muttered, though his voice carried no conviction. Another shook his head almost immediately. No, it's too quiet, too still. They knew the sound of machinery, the heavy chop of rotor blades, the roar of an engine echoing through the trees. But here, in the presence of this hovering light, there was nothing. The silence pressed in from all sides, vast and unnatural, as though the forest itself was listening. A few of the men leaned forward, pressing their hands against the dashboard, peering through the windshield. Their eyes widened, narrowing again as they tried to make sense of the shimmering craft. Curiosity mingled with an undeniable pull to look closer, to understand what they were seeing. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. His knuckles were pale in the dim light of the dashboard. He didn't say a word, but the slowing of the truck spoke for Jim and he was reluctant to move closer, even as the others strained against their own disbelief. One man whispered, "It can't be real." But his voice trembled, because real or not, the glow illuminated the clearing, touched the trees, painted itself against the night. It was there, tangible, present, and for a long, suspended moment, the men sat caught between two forces, the instinct to run, and the undeniable lure to know more. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbroken, until at last Travis moved. He sat near the passenger side, his eyes locked on the glowing craft ahead, where the others shifted uneasily, whispering doubts and warnings. Something in him leaned forward instead. His curiosity outweighed his fear. The sight was too extraordinary, too compelling to ignore. Without a word, he reached for the door handle. The hinges groaned faintly as the door swung open, the sound startling in the quiet. Cold night air spilled into the truck, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. The men stared at him in disbelief, their voices rising in hurried protest. "Travis, don't," one called sharply. "Get back in the truck," another hissed. But he didn't answer. His boots crunched against the gravel as he stepped down, standing now in the open road. The headlights painted him in pale light, his figure framed against the dark trees and the strange glow ahead. For a moment he stood still, his breath clouding faintly in the crisp air. The craft hovered silently, its surface glinting like molten metal beneath the soft radiance it gave off. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, that stepping closer was a risk he couldn't measure. And yet he felt drawn forward, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. The other men leaned toward the windows, their eyes wide, their voices lowered now to frantic whispers. Some urged him to stop. Others were too stunned to speak, but Travis took another step, then another. The distance between him and the glowing object narrowed, and with it, the unease in the truck grew heavier. The night held its breath as Travis Walton walked alone toward the light. The truck sat idling, its low rumble trembling through the seats. While the men inside could only watch, Travis stood alone on the road, his silhouette outlined by the truck's headlights, and beyond him the craft hovered in its silent brilliance. The glow wrapped around him, painting his figure in strange silver tones, as though he were caught halfway between two worlds, the ordinary earth behind him, and something unearthly just ahead. Inside the cab, voices rose in panicked whispers. "Get back, Travis. He's too close. He's crazy." But no one opened a door. No one followed him. Fear pinned them to their seats as tightly as any restraint. Travis moved closer still. His steps were hesitant now, but he did not turn back. The men could see him tilt his head upward, studying the glowing surface, his face pale in the strange light. Then something shifted. The glow around the craft pulsed, brighter for an instant, like a breath. The air itself seemed to thrum faintly, a vibration that was more felt than heard, prickling along the skin. The men inside the truck gasped, their hearts pounding. One of them reached instinctively for the driver's arm. "We've got to go. We've got to get out of here." But still they sat, torn between horror and disbelief, unable to look away. Ahead of them, Travis stood motionless now, only yards from the craft. His figure seemed fragile beneath its looming radiance. The night, the forest, the road, all of it felt suspended, balanced on the edge of something about to break. And then, without warning, the light shifted, again growing sharper, more focused, as if the craft itself had turned its gaze upon him. The men in the truck froze, their fear pressing to the surface. As the forest braced for the moment to come, the clearing seemed suspended in stillness. The forest around them, once alive with the faint chatter of insects and the rustle of branches, remained utterly silent, as though nature itself had withdrawn. Watching from a distance, the craft hovered in the air, unmoving yet alive with light. Its glow washed across the clearing, spilling onto the trees, tracing their needles in silver fire. The shape was clearer, now smooth, rounded, almost metallic, but with no seams, no rivets, no marks of construction. It was as though the object had grown whole, like a stone polished by time. And yet it radiated with a perfection no natural form could carry. Then, faintly, the men felt it. A low vibration, subtle and steady, seemed to ripple through the ground. It was not loud, it was not even sound, not in the ordinary sense. Instead, it was a hum that pressed against the body, a resonance that stirred in the chest and the bones. Travis felt it more keenly than anyone standing nearest to the glow. It was as if the air around him had grown dense, saturated with energy. The light pulsed softly, expanding and contracting in quiet rhythm, like the slow beat of a heart. It casts long shadows across the dirt, bending them strangely as it shifted. For a moment, the glow dimmed, then returned, brighter, as though the craft were breathing in the night air. Inside the truck, the crew sat frozen, their wide eyes locked on the hovering presence. No one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. The hum, the glow, the steady radiance, it all pressed down upon them, filling the clearing with an uncanny weight to each of them. It felt less like a machine and more like a presence, aware and deliberate. Watching the man who stood before it, Travis stood motionless, his face lifted toward the glowing craft. The air around him shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from invisible flames. His chest rose and fell quickly, but still he did not move away. Then, without warning, the light changed. From the underside of the craft, a narrow beam suddenly lanced downward. It was sharp, yet strangely soft, bright as lightning, but steady, holding itself in place. It struck the ground with a pale brilliance, and in that instant, Travis was caught within it. The men in the truck gasped. One of them shouted his name. For a heartbeat, his body seemed frozen in the glow. His figure outlined in stark silver, every detail etched against the dark. Then, as if lifted by an unseen hand, his arms jerked upward, his body arched back, and he was thrown from the ground with sudden force. He struck the earth with a heavy thud just beyond the edge of the beam. For a moment he lay still, his limbs slack, the breath stolen from him. The light above him pulsed once more, steady and unhurried, before dimming back into its quiet glow. The forest remained silent, but the air seemed to tremble, as though the world itself had shivered. The men in the truck stared, their hearts hammering, their disbelief battling against the impossible sight they had just witnessed. Travis did not move. For a moment, no one inside the truck breathed. The clearing was filled only with the fading pulse of the strange glow, the shape of Travis lying still on the ground. Then, all at once, the men erupted. Go, go, we have to get out of here, one shouted, his voice breaking under the weight of terror. Another leaned forward, pounding his hand against the dashboard. The driver's hands trembled on the wheel, his breath ragged. For one desperate second, he hesitated, lying helpless in the dirt. But fear overwhelmed every thought, every instinct except one: survival. The tires spun against the gravel, then caught, jolting the truck forward. The men were thrown back in their seats as the vehicle surged into the night. Branches whipped past the windows, headlights shuddering with each rut and bump in the road. Inside the cab, voices overlapped in panic, some shouting to turn back, others urging to keep going, faster and faster, until nothing of that light could be seen behind them. The hum of the craft faded into the distance, swallowed by the roar of the engine and the pounding of their hearts. The forest that had once been familiar now pressed in around them like a dark, unending wall. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of light between the trees a threat waiting to reveal itself. Still, the truck sped on, as though distance alone could save them from what they had witnessed. And behind them, in that silent clearing, Travis Walton lay alone beneath the hovering glow on the forest floor. Travis stirred faintly, the air around him shimmered with the fading echo of the beam, though the night itself remained silent and still. His chest rose shallowly, his body trembling as though caught between waking and unconsciousness. The strange glow pressed against his eyelids even as they fluttered shut, washing his vision in blurred streaks of silver and gold. His thoughts scattered, slipping away before they could form. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself. Moments lengthened, then vanished, leaving only fragments of sensation. He felt weightless, as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. The cool earth, the scent of pine, the ache in his body, all of it faded into nothing. In its place came only light, filling every corner of his awareness, until there was nothing else left. The last thing he knew was that brilliance surrounding him, neither warm nor cold, neither comforting nor cruelly endless. Overwhelming then, everything went dark. The truck rattled violently down the dirt road before the driver finally eased his foot from the accelerator. The engine growled into a lower hum, the tires spitting gravel as the vehicle slowed. Inside, the men sat pressed against their seats, breathless, their eyes wide with shock. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rattle of the suspension and the harsh rhythm of their breathing. Then, at last, one of them broke the silence. "What did we just see?" His voice was thin, stretched tight with fear. Another man answered almost immediately, his words tumbling out too fast. "It wasn't real. It can't be. That thing, whatever it was, it couldn't have been real." But even as he spoke, he knew how hollow the denial sounded. They had all seen it. They had all seen Travis struck by the light, lifted and thrown down like a rag doll. There was no way to pretend it hadn't happened. Whispers overlapped, voices sharp, uncertain, trembling. Some swore it had to be military. Others argued no machine could move or glow that way, not in silence, not with that kind of force. The explanations cracked under the weight of what they had witnessed, leaving only fragments of reason scattered across their panic, and always, beneath the frantic words, there lingered a heavier truth. Travis was still back there, alone, unmoving, the weight of it pressed on them all. stealing the breath from their lungs as they sat in that shaking truck on a lonely Arizona road. The truck slowed to a crawl, the driver's knuckles white on the steering wheel. For a moment, it seemed they might turn around. The thought hung heavy in the air, an unspoken pullback to the clearing where Travis had fallen. One of the men finally voiced it. "We can't just leave him there." His words cracked as they left his throat. "He's one of us." Another immediately snapped back, his voice rising in raw panic. "And what do you expect us to do? You saw it. You all saw it. That thing, whatever it was, just knocked him down like nothing. You want to go back and stand under it too?" The truck grew quiet again. No one wanted to admit it, but the fear inside each of them was stronger than any sense of duty. Their imaginations filled with the glowing beam. With the thought of the craft turning its gaze upon them next, someone whispered, "Maybe he's already gone." The words struck like a stone. Sinking deep into the silence, the driver's foot shifted uncertainly between brake and accelerator. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, though there was nothing behind them but darkness. His breath rattled in his chest. Every nerve in his body screamed to keep going, to put distance between himself and that impossible light. The others sat frozen, torn between the weight of loyalty and the crushing instinct to survive. And slowly, fear tipped the balance. The truck continued down the road, carrying them farther and farther from the man they had left behind. The truck rattled deeper into the woods before at last it slowed again, the driver's conscience clawing against his fear. The silence inside the cab had grown unbearable, heavy with guilt, heavy with the image of Travis lying on the cold ground. Finally, one of them spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We can't just leave him there." The others shifted uneasily. Their eyes darted between one another, searching for agreement, for courage. Slowly, reluctantly, the driver eased the truck to a stop. For a long moment, no one moved. The night pressed close around them, the forest alive only with their uneven breaths. Then, with trembling resolve, the driver turned the wheel and began the long, grinding reverse down the road. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the truck groaned back toward the place they had fled. The closer they came, the more their hearts pounded. The glow no longer shone between the trees, and yet their fear only deepened. They expected it to appear again at any moment, to blaze suddenly before them, to swallow them whole. At last, the headlights swept across the clearing. The men leaned forward in their seats, their eyes searching desperately for the shape of their friend. But there was nothing. The ground was bare, the dirt undisturbed, except for the faint scuff marks where Travis had fallen. The craft was gone, the glow was gone, and Travis was nowhere to be seen. A heavy silence fell over the men. Some swore under their breath, others simply stared, their mouths dry, their throats tight. The clearing had become emptier than before, as though whatever had happened had erased him from the world entirely. At last, one of the men whispered, "He's gone, just gone." The driver swallowed hard and turned the key. The truck lurched forward, its headlights cutting once more through the endless trees. This time, no one suggested turning back. No one looked out the window. Each man sat rigid, locked in his own thoughts, as though speaking might draw that strange light down upon them again. The dirt road wound endlessly beneath their tires. carrying them farther from the place where their world had split in two. Ahead lay the faint promise of town, the unease twisted in their chests. How could they explain what had just happened? Who would believe that a friend had been swallowed by a beam of light? One man muttered into the tense silence, "They'll think we're crazy." Another answered, his voice hollow or worse, "They'll think we did something to him." The thought hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. Still, there was no choice. Travis was gone, and the world had to be told. The truck pushed onward toward the distant glow of town, carrying 7 men who would soon find themselves at the center of one of the strangest stories ever told. The truck rolled into town just past nightfall, its headlights dim under the glow of street lamps. What should have been an ordinary evening in the quiet Arizona town carried an unnatural weight. The men climbed out slowly, their boots scraping against the gravel as if each sound might draw unwanted attention. They made their way to the nearest station, shoulders hunched, faces pale beneath the harsh yellow lights. The air smelled of dust and faint tobacco smoke. A lone officer at the desk looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from routine boredom to concern as he saw the group file in. At first, the words stumbled out, broken fragments of sentences, half-starts, voices cracking under the strain. The officer raised a skeptical brow, leaning back in his chair. "A light in the woods. Your friend taken." His pencil tapped lightly against his notepad. The men nodded, some avoiding his gaze, others gripping the edge of the counter until their knuckles whitened. Though their story sounded outrageous, there was no mistaking the tremor in their voices, the raw fear in their eyes. The officer set the pencil down. He didn't believe them, not yet, but something in their shaken presence told him this was no ordinary tale. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll call the sheriff." Within the hour, more uniforms appeared, their boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. They asked questions, repeated details, pressed the men to clarify every moment. Each answer only deepened the strange gulf between belief and disbelief. The lawmen exchanged uneasy glances. It was too wild, too impossible. But there was no denying it. One man was missing, and the rest carried the look of men who had truly seen something they could not explain. By the next morning, the small town was no longer quiet. Word had slipped from the station walls, carried in hushed tones through diners, gas stations, and grocery aisles. A man had vanished in the woods, in a light from the sky. At first, it sounded like another tall tale, a campfire story told by tired loggers. But the more people whispered, the more the story grew. Neighbors repeated what they had heard from someone close to the crew. Children pressed their faces to windows, listening as their parents muttered about strange happenings in the forest. Then, the first reporters arrived. Old cars rattled down dusty roads, radios humming with static, as journalists scribbled notes on folded pads. A photographer lifted his camera in front of the sheriff's office, capturing images of the crew as they shuffled inside under questioning. Headlines began to appear in nearby papers. "Man missing in Arizona. Forest crew reports strange lights." Some stories mocked the claim, brushing it aside as nonsense, while others printed every word with bold certainty. In cafes and on front porches, the debates grew louder. Some said the men had stumbled onto a secret government experiment. Others whispered of hoaxes, foul play, or worse. The air in town felt different, now charged, restless. People walked a little faster, glanced a little more often toward the dark stretch of forest beyond the hills. Something had happened out there, something they could not name, and curiosity had begun to spread like wildfire. And though the reporters scribbled eagerly, though the sheriff held firm to his skeptical stance, no one could ignore one truth: Travis Walton was still missing. Days passed, and the story refused to fade. Instead, it tightened around the men like a noose. Each time they stepped into the sheriff's office, they felt the watchful eyes of a town that wanted answers. Inside the rooms were plain bare walls, a ticking clock, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Yet to the crew, they might as well have been interrogation chambers. Officers leaned forward, repeating the same questions again and again. What did you see? Why didn't you stop it? Why did you run? The men gave the same answers each time, though their voices grew weary. The details etched deeper with each telling. There was a light. Travis stepped out. The beam took him. Their words sounded no less strange on the 10th telling than on the first. Still, suspicion hung heavy in the air. Whispers began to shift from curiosity to accusation. Had the men harmed their coworker? Was this tale of lights and strange beams only a desperate cover for a darker truth? In an attempt to cut through the haze of doubt, authorities brought in expertsmen trained to measure truth not by words but by the steady beat of a heart, the faint tremor of a hand. Polygraph machines were set up, wires draped across tables, needles ready to scratch truth or lies into paper. One by one, the crew sat in the chair. The straps tightened around their arms, the machines clicked and whirred, and the questions came. Did you kill Travis Walton? Did you see him struck by a beam of light? Are you lying about what happened that night? The tests dragged on, slow and meticulous. When at last the results were reviewed, the conclusion was clear. Nearly all of the men had told the truth. The story was unbelievable, yes, but their sincerity was not. For the first time, the room fell into uneasy silence. The officers could no longer dismiss the tale so easily. Something had happened in those woods, something their questions could not unravel. The days that followed seemed endless. Each sunrise over the Arizona hills carried the same quiet dread, and each sunset only deepened the hollow absence. Search parties combed the forest, their boots crunching through dry pine needles, flashlights slicing through the dark. Helicopters beat the air above, circling the same wide stretches of wilderness, but always returning empty-handed. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of struggle, only the silence of the forest, vast and unbroken. In town, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. Families spoke in low voices, unwilling to let their children linger outside after dusk. The crew, exhausted and pale, kept to themselves, haunted by the memory of what they had seen. Reporters filled the sidewalks, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp and relentless. Each headline grew more sensational than the last. Some painted the men as liars, others as reluctant witnesses to something beyond human understanding. But no matter how many words were printed, no matter how many theories filled the air, one truth could not be shaken. Travis Walton was still missing. 5 days passed, then 6. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer that never came. Until, on the 7th night, that silence was broken. Darkness gave way to a dim glow. soft and hazy, as if filtered through layers of mist. Travis stirred, his body heavy, his thoughts tangled like threads he could not untangle. Every breath felt strange, thin, shallow, filled with an unfamiliar scent that clung to his lungs. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The world above him was not the sky he knew, nor the ceiling of any hospital. Instead, it shimmered faintly, as though the walls themselves breathed with light, shapes bent in curves and angles that defied the straight, sturdy lines of human design. His limbs ached as he tried to move. His hands met a surface smooth and cold beneath him, metal, yet warmer than steel, as if alive with its own faint pulse. Confusion pressed hard against his mind. Was this a dream born of exhaustion? Or had he awakened somewhere far from the forests of Arizona? He blinked again, his vision clearing in fragments. The room was silent, but for a low hum, steady and endless, vibrating through his bones. Shadows shifted at the edge of his sight, though when he turned his head, nothing was there. His heart quickened, yet even his fear felt dulled, wrapped in a haze that slowed his thoughts. He tried to sit up, his body trembling with the effort, every motion unfamiliar in this strange place. Where was he? What had happened after the light? The questions circled in his mind, but no answers came. Only the strange glow, the silence, and the unsettling truth that he was no longer in the world he had known. As Travis's eyes adjusted, the details of his surroundings emerged with greater clarity. The walls curved upward in seamless arcs, as though the entire chamber had been shaped from a single piece of some unknown material. There were no bolts, no seams, no lines where one surface met another. Everything flowed together in soft, organic curves, glowing faintly with a pearly light that shifted from silver to pale gold as he stared. The air carried a stillness unlike anything he had ever known. It was neither cold nor warm, yet it pressed against his skin with a subtle weight, as though the room itself were breathing around him. Each inhalation brought a faint tang, sharp and metallic, leaving the back of his throat dry. Across the chamber, smooth panels gleamed with a brightness that seemed to rise and fade, pulsing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Strange shapes, neither buttons nor screens, were set into the walls, glowing faintly as though alive. Some seemed to ripple when he looked directly at them, their forms shifting just beyond understanding. Above, the ceiling shimmered like water touched by moonlight, alive with subtle motion. The glow gave no shadows, yet lit every curve and surface, soft and even. Travis turned his head slowly, drawn into the fluid harmony of the space. It felt designed not by hands, but by something that shaped matter with thought alone. A low hum vibrated through the floor and into his chest, steady, endless, a sound that was not heard so much as felt. The longer he lay there, the more it lulled him, like the deep drone of wind through pine trees at night. And though confusion pressed against his mind, there was also something strangely serene about the place, as though he were balanced between wonder and fear, between the beauty of the unknown and the terror of being utterly alone within it. At first, Travis thought the shifting in the corner of his vision was only his weary eyes playing tricks. The glow of the walls had a way of bending light, making edges blur and ripple. But then, slowly, the shapes took form. 3 figures stood nearby, motionless, half veiled in the pale radiance. They were smaller than men, their frames delicate, their movements so smooth that it was hard to tell when one ended and the next began. As his gaze focused, he saw their heads larger in proportion to their bodies, with smooth, rounded contours that gleamed faintly in the light. Their eyes, wide and dark, held no malice, only a depth that unsettled him in its silence. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, catching the glow of the chamber like polished stone. For a moment, fear surged in his chest, sharp and instinctive. He wanted to cry out, to push himself from the smooth table and flee, but his body remained heavy, his voice trapped in his throat. The beings did not approach. They simply watched, their stillness somehow both unnerving and strangely calming. Travis's fear wavered, replaced with something softer, hesitant. There was nothing in their posture that spoke of harm. Instead, it felt as though he were being studied gently, like a bird held in careful hands. The hum of the chamber deepened, vibrating softly through the floor. Travis's heart slowed, his breath evening out against his will. The longer he met those dark, endless eyes, the less certain he felt of where his fear ended and his wonder began. He had never seen such beings. Yet a part of him felt as though they had always been here waiting, just beyond the edges of human sight, for long moments. Travis lay in that strange chamber, held by the steady hum, the unbroken gaze of the beings. His fear had softened, tempered by a strange calm, yet the instinct to survive pressed harder with each breath. The figures did not move closer, but their presence wrapped around him like invisible weight. He could not read their intentions, and in that silence, his uncertainty grew sharp again. A thought stirred at the back of his mind, quiet but insistent. I shouldn't be here. With effort, he pushed against the smooth surface beneath him. His arms trembled, his body weak, but at last he managed to sit halfway upright. The beings tilted their heads, watching, their great eyes unblinking. Still, they made no sound. The chamber seemed to shift around him as he moved, walls bending with a liquid glow, the air pressing thicker against his chest. Each motion drained him, yet the need to escape carried him forward. His breath quickened, echoing louder in the stillness. Something deep within him refused to remain passive, refused to surrender to the unknown. Fear returned, not wild or frantic, but steady, determined. He would not stay. With one last effort, Travis swung his legs over the edge of the surface, his bare feet meeting the floor that pulsed faintly beneath him. The hum grew louder, and the figures stirred at last, as though realizing his intent. And in that moment, he knew whatever this place was, he had to find a way out. The chamber pulsed around him, light bending and warping, as though the very air had become liquid. Travis stumbled forward, his vision swimming, the hum rising to a pitch that pressed against his skull. He reached out, desperate for something solid, but his hands met only empty air. Then, in a blink, it was gone. He collapsed onto hard ground, the cold bite of earth and pine needles scraping against his palms. The air was sharp and real, filled with the scent of soil, the resin of trees, and the cool night wind whispering through branches. For a long moment, he lay there gasping, his body trembling, the world spinning around him. Above, the sky stretched vast and black, strewn with stars that burned steady and familiar. No glowing walls, no strange figures, only the eternal Arizona night. Travis tried to sit up, but his body felt unsteady, as though he had been drained of strength. He blinked hard, his eyes struggling to adjust to the natural darkness after the dreamlike radiance of the chamber. Every breath reminded him that he was back where he belonged, though he could not remember how. His last memory was of rising to his feet in that impossible room, surrounded by beings whose eyes had followed him in silence. And now he was here, shaken, disoriented, and overwhelmed. Travis lifted his face to the stars and whispered the only thought he could grasp. "I'm alive." The forest pressed close around him as Travis forced himself upright, his legs trembling with each unsteady step. The air felt heavier now. Every sound sharpened the crack of a twig beneath his boots. The distant hoot of an owl, the endless whisper of wind through the pines. He walked without direction, guided only by instinct, each movement clumsy, yet desperate. His clothing was torn, his body thin, his skin pale as if starved of sunlight. The cool night air stung against him, but he welcomed it. Clinging to the proof that this world was real, hours seemed to blur as he stumbled along dirt roads and quiet lanes, until, at last, the faint lights of town flickered in the distance. His heart swelled with relief and dread in equal measure. What day was it? How long had he been gone? When he stepped onto the first paved street, the town lay hushed in darkness, windows glowing faintly with lamps inside. He moved like a ghost, slow and weary, until the sound of his uneven steps drew notice. A door creaked open, and someone gasped. Within minutes, word spread. Neighbors gathered on porches, voices rising in disbelief. "It's him. It's Travis." Faces stared wide-eyed as he passed, some crossing themselves, others backing away as though they had seen an apparition. He could barely speak, his voice hoarse and broken. "Water. I need water." The words fell softly, almost swallowed by the night, guided by shaking hands. He was led toward the lights of safety, though he could feel the weight of every gaze. He had returned, but he was no longer simply the man who had vanished. He was the man who had come back from something no one could name. When the news reached his family, they rushed through the night, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. For nearly a week, they had lived in the shadow of uncertainty, torn between prayers for his safety and fears of the worst. Now, at the threshold of the small clinic where he had been taken, they hesitated, almost afraid to see what waited inside. And there he was. Travis sat hunched on a cot, his shoulders bowed, a blanket draped loosely around him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, yet unmistakably alive. The room fell silent as his family entered, their gasps catching in their throats. His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely before she could stop them. She rushed forward, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. "Oh, Travis, my boy." Her voice broke on the words. One of his brothers gripped the edge of the cot, staring as though he couldn't trust his own eyes. "We thought you were gone," he whispered. Travis's lips parted, but only a broken sound came out. His hand reached forward, weak and shaking, before falling again into his lap. The door opened once more, and the crew appeared, those who had been with him on that night, who had carried the burden of a story no one wanted to believe. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, as they saw him sitting there, alive. Returned from the impossible, relief washed over them in waves, but beneath it was something else: fear. fear of what he had seen, fear of what his presence confirmed in that room. Joy and dread intertwined, leaving everyone with the same quiet thought. Life would never be the same again. For a time, no one asked questions. His family clung to him. The crew stood in stunned silence, and the town seemed to hold its breath. The impossible had happened. Travis Walton had returned, but silence cannot last. Before long, the questions came. Doctors wanted to examine him. Lawmen wanted statements. Reporters wanted answers. How had he survived? Where had he been for nearly a week? And what did he remember of that night in the forest? Travis tried to speak, but his words faltered. Fragments came out, strange lights, a room of glowing walls, figures that were not human. The more he said, the deeper the divide grew. Some listened with wide-eyed belief, convinced they were witnessing proof of something beyond the world they knew. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was madness, lies, or a desperate cover story. The weight of the town's eyes fell heavy upon him. What had begun as whispers in diners and gas stations now spread far beyond Arizona. News vans arrived, reporters jostled for space, and the quiet town found itself thrust into the glare of national attention. And in the center of it all sat Travis, weary and fragile, a man both saved and burdened by his return. His story was only beginning, and with it, the world's restless debate. The small Arizona town that once moved at the pace of dusty roads and quiet evenings was suddenly alive with a storm of attention. Reporters crowded the sidewalks, their cameras flashing like bursts of lightning. Satellite trucks rumbled in, their dishes spinning toward the sky, ready to beam the story across the nation. Everywhere, the name Travis Walton was on people's lips. Newspapers splashed it across front pages, radio shows dissected it with urgency, and television anchors spoke his story into living rooms far beyond the pine forests of Arizona. And yet, the story was never told the same way twice. To some, he was living proof of contact with beings from beyond the stars. A man who had endured what most of humanity only feared in nightmares. To others, he was a fraud, a liar chasing fame, or part of some elaborate hoax that had gone too far. The debates grew louder. Ministers preached about demons. Scientists scoffed about delusion. Neighbors whispered, some with awe, some with suspicion. The town itself seemed to split into two, those who believed and those who would never accept a word of it. And, in the middle of that raging storm, stood Travis, fragile and quiet, watching as his life was pulled apart by forces far bigger than the forest where it all began. As the media storm swirled, another tide rolled in, one quieter in its approach, but no less consuming. Investigators, researchers, men and women with notebooks, tape recorders, and endless questions. Some came with wide eyes and open hearts, eager to listen, certain that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They leaned in close to Travis, gently urging him to share every detail, the shape of the craft, the glow of the walls, the faces of the beings. For them, every word was a piece of evidence, a puzzle piece to fit into the greater mystery of UFO contact. Others came with cold stares and furrowed brows, determined not to be swayed. They tested him with traps of logic, with questions designed to trip him up, to expose cracks in his story. To them, Travis was not a witness, but a suspect. even within these circles, disagreements flared. Some declared his account the most credible ever recorded, backed by polygraph results and the testimony of 6 other men. Others dismissed it as a clever fabrication, an elaborate tale born from fear, confusion, or even an accident that had spun out of control. Through it all, Travis remained steady, his voice soft, his story unchanging. Whether met with belief or doubt, he repeated the same quiet truth. This is what happened to me. And as each investigator left, carrying their version of the story out into the world, the legend of that November night grew larger than the Arizona hills themselves. While Travis stood at the center of the storm, the other 6 men carried their own invisible weight. They returned to their logging work, but the rhythm was never the same. The crack of axes against wood, unearthly in town, they became subjects of gossip. Some people called them brave men who had faced the unknown and lived to tell it. Others muttered behind their backs, accusing them of lying, of conspiring in some strange hoax. For men who once blended easily into the quiet background of rural life, being doubted stung almost as much as the fear that had once gripped them on that lonely road. Nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, each man replayed the moment when Travis was struck by that beam of light. They remembered the surge of panic, the decision to flee, and the sickening dread when they realized he was gone. No matter how much time passed, guilt sat heavy in their hearts. Should they have stayed? Should they have fought the fear and run back sooner? Even though polygraphs had cleared them, even though they swore again and again that what they saw was real, suspicion clung to them like dust on their boots, and so they moved on in body, but not in spirit. They carried the memory of that November night wherever they went, bound together forever by an experience no one else could truly understand. As weeks turned into months, one truth became undeniable. The Travis Walton case was not fading into silence. Instead, it grew louder, reaching beyond Arizona, beyond America, echoing into the wider world. Books began to be written, documentaries produced, late-night radio shows replaying the details in hushed voices. Conferences on UFOs cited Travis's name as if it were scripture. His experience became a cornerstone, one of the most famous and enduring abduction stories in history. For believers, it was a beacon case that could not be dismissed, anchored by multiple witnesses, investigations, and a man who never changed his account. For skeptics, it became a target, a story to pick apart, to dissect endlessly, as though tearing at its edges could erase the mystery at its heart. And yet, for all the noise, the core of the story remained simple. 7 men went into the forest one November night, and only 6 came back. When Travis returned, his life and theirs were forever changed. The Arizona forest stood silent through it all, holding its secrets in the whisper of the pines. But the world had already claimed the story, carrying it far from the mountains where it began, turning it into legend. And from that legend, the path leads us back into the quiet woods themselves, into a final reflection among the trees. In the end, the story always circles back to the forest. The same Arizona hills still rise against the horizon, their slopes covered in towering pines that whisper in the breeze. The air is still crisp and scented with resin, carrying the earthy perfume of needles and bark. Time moves slowly here, as though the world beyond the headlines, the debates, the endless questions never truly touched this place. At night, the forest deepens into a hush that feels eternal. Stars spill across the sky, unbothered by human arguments, shining with the same quiet light they have for centuries. The ground is cool, the air still, and the vastness of the wilderness stretches endlessly, reminding all who enter that life here is small, and the universe is wide. It is here, in this calm silence, that the echoes of that November night still linger, not loud, not urgent, but woven into the atmosphere like a secret memory. The trees keep it, the wind carries it, the soil, in its patient way, remembers. The forest remains timeless, unchanged, holding within it a story that altered everything, yet left its own rhythm untouched. It is striking to think that just one evening, one fleeting moment beneath the stars, could ripple through so many lives. For Travis, it was a journey that reshaped his very sense of reality, leaving him forever balanced between wonder and unease. For the men who were with him, it was a memory they would never escape, a bond forged in fear and disbelief, tying them together long after their logging days ended. Families, too, were touched by it. Wives who waited in silence, children who grew up under the shadow of whispered rumors, brothers and sisters who defended their loved ones when others doubted them. And beyond Arizona, the ripples spread wider. People who never set foot in those pine woods felt the tremor of that story. Some found hope in it, believing that humanity was not alone. Others found fear, unsettled by the thought that such a thing could happen without warning, in a place so ordinary, on a night so unremarkable. One night, one light in the trees, and the world was never quite the same. For all the books written, all the interviews recorded, and all the debates waged, the truth of what happened that November night remains just beyond reach. The questions linger like mist above the forest floor. What was the light in the trees? Who were the beings Travis described, with their strange forms and silent gazes? Why was he taken, and why was he returned? Skeptics still search for cracks in the story, pointing to human error, confusion, or elaborate tricks. Believers hold tight to the certainty that this was something far greater, a brush with the unknown that stands among the clearest ever told, and yet neither side has fully answered the heart of the mystery. The forest keeps its silence. The stars give no reply. The truth, like the craft itself, seems to hover just out of reach, seen for a moment, then gone again into the dark. It is this absence of certainty that keeps the story alive. As alive today as when Travis first stumbled back into town. A mystery unsolved is a story that never fades. And so, the story of Travis Walton, of his crew, and of that night in the Arizona forest, drifts quietly into the realm of legend. The world has debated, believed, and doubted, but the forest itself remains unchanged, trees still rising, its stars still shining, its silence still deep. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere far beyond our grasp, waiting among the stars. Or perhaps it lingers in the hush of the pines, in a place only the night remembers as you rest now. Let your thoughts settle like leaves falling softly to the ground. Breathe deeply, as though you too are standing in that still forest. The cool air around you, the universe stretching endlessly above. Not every question needs an answer. Not every mystery must be solved. Sometimes, It is enough simply to wonder and to dream good night, and may your sleep be calm, your thoughts light, and your journey gentle as the stars watch over you.